You are listening to the People First podcast.
People First is a self-advocacy group run by people with learning disabilities, and People First podcast is a platform to raise awareness about real issues that affect people with learning disabilities in our community and all around the world.
We aim to inform and entertain our listeners by interviewing interesting guests and talking about the things that really matter to us. This is like having a stage to speak out and get our voices heard.
Hello, on this episode of a podcast, you hear two interviews. First, you will hear our interview Simon Jarrett, the author of a book called Those They Called Idiots. It's Simon's book all about the history, how people with learning disabilities have been treated in society over the years. We want to talk to Simon about how or why he wrote the book and his magazine, Curity Living. Our second interview is with our local Member of Parliament, Robbie, who's visited us at our annual Learning Holiday Conference. First up, here's Simon Jarrett talking to Tom and Luke over Zoom.
Many thanks for joining us today.
Pleasure to be here.
Who inspired you, or what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And I think that the main answer to that is that for a lot of my life, I had worked with, supported, worked alongside people with learning disabilities. So I spent a lot of my life with people with learning disabilities and had become very interested in the history of people as a group. And I had many friends and acquaintances who were learning disabled people. So I think it was from them that I got the inspiration to want to write this history. And I do write at the very beginning of the book about how a long time ago, when I was in my 20s, I worked in one of the old mental handicap hospitals, and I was a nursing assistant. And when I went into work on the first day, there were a lot of sort of old men in there who had been in this hospital since they were children. And I read the notes that were written about them when they had come into the hospital a long time ago, near the beginning of the 20th century. And I just became very interested in why there had been this world in the past where people were taken out of society and put into hospitals. So I think they were an inspiration for me as well.
Why is it important that people read the book?
Well, I think it's important for a couple of reasons. One of the things I found over the years was working with people who worked with people with learning disabilities. They very often didn't know the history. They just had a very vague understanding that in the past, maybe people were put into hospitals, but they had come out of them and things were okay now. And I feel that it's really important to have an understanding of history to understand how we have got to where we are today, because so much of what we do is shaped by the past and by our history. And there's another reason why I think people should read it. We tend to think that today we always do things better than people did them in the past. And in my book, I do write about the terrible things that happened in asylums, the long stay hospitals in the 19th and 20th centuries, where a lot of abuse and bad things took place. But I also write about the time before the hospitals. I write about the 18th century, when people lived in their communities. And I found out a lot of information about how people lived in those days. And we're talking about 300 years ago. And people were very much part of their communities in that time. They were accepted. They lived with their families. They were well known in their neighborhoods. A lot of them had jobs and so on. And actually, they were very integrated and included in their communities. And so we talk a lot about people being included today, although we have problems in making sure that people do feel they're included members of their community. And I think we can learn from that past how people lived in the 18th century about what a really inclusive community looks like.
How long does it take to research and write a book like this? And how did you do your research?
All right, yeah, well, that's a big question. Well, I started doing my research in 2011, and the book came out in 2020. So that was 9 years of work, really, into the book. And the way I did my research, I changed my job, and I went and did a master's degree at Birkbeck University in London. And then I did a PhD for 3 years, full-time, at Birkbeck University. So it gave me a lot of time to start this research and do the studying. And what I wanted to do, particularly when I was trying to find out about the lives of people in the 18th century before the asylums, people told me you won't be able to find anything about those people because they didn't read or write, and they weren't regarded as important in society. So where will you find anything? How will you find anything? And I thought, well, if people weren't in asylums, I'm sure they were living in their communities. So if I just try and find out about those communities, I'm sure that I will find people with learning disabilities from that time. And I did. So the sort of things I looked at, I looked, for example, at the court records of the Old Bailey, which you might know, it's still the big criminal court in London where they do the criminal trials. And there are records of all the cases. And I found a lot of cases where people were going on trial, and you'll have to forgive the language because this is the language of the past, but people who were referred to as idiots in that time, which was the old-fashioned language, and it wasn't an insult at that time like it is today. And you got people who'd maybe done some shoplifting or had picked someone's pocket or were handling some stolen goods, and they were appearing in these trials. And what really interested me about them was that a lot of friends and family and workmates and employers would turn up at these trials to defend people, and they'd say, oh, look, we know he's done something silly, but you know, we've known him for years and he's a very reliable and honest person, and if you release him, we'll look after him and make sure he doesn't get into any trouble. So those trials showed me that a lot of people who were the same as like people with learning disabilities today were well known and well respected and well integrated in their communities. And I looked at other things. I looked at paintings and cartoons from that time. And people had a particular idea of what people with learning disabilities looked like. So I could find things in there. I looked in joke books. I looked in newspapers. I looked in the slang language that people used at the time. And also court cases about whether people had the capacity to get married or whether they could manage their own affairs just like we have today. And again, in all those places, I found lots of signs that people with learning disabilities were very much an accepted part of everyday life at that time.
It must be quite heavy going, writing and researching a book like this. How did you relax and take your mind off it when you're not working?
Oh, that's a good question. I've never been asked that one before. Yeah, you can get very obsessed with your writing and your research. And I work from home as well. Sometimes I'd go into libraries and archives and things, but a lot of the time I'd be working from home, and it was very difficult to stop it. And I'll tell you a story. One night, my wife and I went out for a meal with two friends, and when we came away afterwards, my wife said to me, "You do know that when people ask you how your research is going, they don't really want to know." Because somebody had asked me how my research was going, and then I'd just gone on and on talking about all my court cases and everything. And actually, our friends weren't as interested in it as I was. So it is important to be able to take yourself away from it, and it helps you to think more clearly about it as well. And I love things like dance. I really love dance, and I'm the chair of a dance company called Coralie in London, where we have very talented dancers who have learning disabilities, and we develop their careers and help with their training and their skill development in dance. So I spend a lot of time going to dance performances, all types of dance performances, with friends and relatives, and I like sport as well. And I made a fish pond in my garden. So I have a lot of different things that I do. So I do have a life outside research, and I think it's very important actually that you do have a life outside your work.
Did you think of any alternate titles for the book?
I know that the title of the book is a bit controversial because it has this word idiots in it, and we know that idiots is a very bad word today and it is used as an insult. But the title of the book is actually Those They Called Idiots, right? And what I was trying to show was that, first of all, the language changes all the time, okay? And in the past, we had idiots and we had other bad words like mental defectives and imbeciles and mentally handicapped and so on. And today we use learning disabilities and sometimes learning difficulties or whatever. And I've seen the language change a number of times in my lifetime. And the thing is, the language we use today, we think is okay. But in 10 or 20 years' time, probably people will think that that this was bad language, and they want to change it, and there'll be another title in the future. And I think the problem is that because people with learning disabilities are often not treated well in society and find themselves towards the bottom of society, the language that is used to describe them is often used in a bad way, even if it didn't start out in a bad way at the beginning, and it becomes like an insult or a term of abuse. And so one of the points I tried to make in the book is that when people were called idiots in the 18th century, it wasn't an insult, it was just the term that was used, but it became an insult later. And that's happened ever since with all the language. And so I think that was the point I was trying to make, really. Those they called idiots in the 18th century were the same group of people that are known as people with learning disabilities today, but the language didn't mean the same then as it's come to mean later. So that's why I stuck with that title for the book. I wanted people to think about the language and how it changes.
Do you know what your next book will be about?
Right, well, I'm just finishing another book, and this one is quite different. It's about the history of disability in England, and it's about all disabilities. So it's about physical disabilities, blindness, deafness, mental illness, and learning disability. And it covers a very long period. It goes all the way from the Middle Ages, 1,000 years ago, to today. And it's actually a very short book. So I'm covering a lot of things in one short book. And the reason is that this book is really aimed at people who are new to the history of disability, and it's like an introduction for them to show how the history of disability has changed over the last 1,000 years. And so then if they want to learn more, they can go off and read more detailed books about particular types of disability at different times. But it's really aimed at sort of younger people who might be new to it, or just members of the public who want to learn about this history, because it's a fascinating history, you know. And I also argue in that book that until the 19th century and the asylums were built, all people with disabilities were very integrated into society. Life wasn't perfect, bad things happened, but they weren't seen as people who should live separately from everybody else. But that's the latest one, and we're just doing the last bits of work on it, and with a bit of luck it will come out later this year.
Can you tell us why the terms used to refer to people change so often?
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit like I was saying just now. One of the problems is that these terms like mental handicap, mental defective, they start out as medical terms, right? They're what doctors use to describe people, and they're the official term. But then they get taken up and used as insults against people. You know, somebody would say you're a defective, sort of thing, as a way of putting them down. And as I said, I think this is partly to do with the low status that people with learning disabilities have often had in their societies. But I think there's another thing that happens. And I think when the language changes, it's because different groups of people are sort of laying a claim to be the people who look after or control people with learning disabilities. So let me give you an example. The term mental defective was introduced by doctors, and that was in the 19th century. Now, you might be interested to know that before the 19th century, doctors weren't interested in people with learning disabilities. As far as they were concerned, they were just people with learning disabilities who didn't have any health needs or medical needs any different to anybody else. They just happened to be the way that they were. And so when doctors came in and said, oh, these are people that we should look after and we should control and we should treat and we should diagnose, they gave them a name, and that was like staking a claim. So it said these mental defectives are our people to put into the asylums. And these days, psychologists, for example, talk about cognitive disability, and academics working in university talk about intellectual disability. They're all giving their own names to this group of people because they're saying this is our job to write about or diagnose or treat these people.
What do you think of the new term intellectual disability?
Yes, well, I just mentioned that, and that's a term that's come out of the universities. Nobody in university history departments and things used to be very interested in the history of learning disabilities. There were very few people who were writing about it, but it's become a bit more of a popular subject lately, which is good because it means that more people are researching the past. I do hope that when people do that, they're going to do it with people with learning disabilities. There's great work going on at the Open University and in a number of other places of what we call activist historians. So that's people with learning disabilities who are actually doing the research themselves, sometimes alongside a co-researcher from the university. So it's a good thing. More and more people are getting interested in the history of learning disability. But again, this thing has happened because there's an interest in the universities. They've decided to choose their own term, their own name. And so, universities are full of people with intellects. And so I think they've introduced this term of intellectual disability, which you're seeing in quite a few places now. The problem for me with all these terms really is that they're never chosen by people themselves. So that, people with learning disabilities don't have much of a choice in how they are referred to. And I'll tell you what I think is another problem. When I look back at trials and other things that happened in the 18th century, people use this term idiot, which we find very offensive, right? But you'd hear somebody, a witness at a trial, say something like, "Oh, I know this man. He's an idiot, but actually he's the most reliable and honest and hardworking man I've ever known. And I shared a room with him for 2 years when we were builders, blah, blah, and so on." And what he had an understanding of that person as a person, right? The least important thing to him was that person had got a learning disability. He was much more interested in him as a man and a friend and a workmate. And I think our problem today is that we're so fond of using these terms, which we change all the time, and we say, oh, this is a person with a learning disability. This is a person with a cognitive disability, intellectual disability. And we feel like that's all there is to say about that person. And of course it isn't, So I think people use these terms and they lose sight of the person. They just define them by a term and nothing else, and don't take an interest in what that person can do, what they're like, what they feel, what they think, and so on.
What do you think about the proposed changes to the Human Rights Bill, and specifically liberty, protection, safeguards?
Yes, well, that's a very tricky question, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you a terribly good answer to it. I don't know if you know, but as well as writing this book, I also edit a magazine called Community Living Magazine, which is a magazine about learning disability. And I've actually got somebody is going to write an article for us about the changes to this, the proposed changes to this bill. And there's a lot of worry that people are going to have less rights, be less safeguarded, less protected under the changes that are going to happen. But there's also a worry about safeguarding legislation that often it stops people from doing anything. People end up getting so protected that they're not allowed to take any risks, and they're not allowed to live their lives. And so, you can live quite a miserable life if you're not allowed to take any risks and have any protection. So there seem to be two schools of thought about these changes as to whether they're going to be a helpful move or not. But my worry is I'm not sure that the changes have been thought through properly, and I'm not sure they're going to result in both better rights and better protection. People do need protection from exploitation and abuse, but they also need the ability to be able to live their lives. So I'm talking to people about this and I'm trying to work out my position, but at the moment I'm concerned really about where it's going.
Can you tell us more about the magazine?
About the magazine?
Yeah.
Well, Community Living Magazine has been going for 30 years now, over 30 years. We come out 4 times a year every 3 months. And we're basically a magazine about learning disability. And we campaign for equal citizenship for people with learning disabilities. So we try to have quite a wide range of articles in every issue. We have some articles that are written by people with learning disabilities themselves. We have articles about the law and about benefits, about people's life stories, about good work that different organisations are doing and things that individuals are doing. And what we're trying to do is we use it as a place where people can learn and debate with each other, and where all the big issues about learning disability appear. I'm going to very quickly lean over and just get you. This is a copy of the latest issue, which came out a couple of months ago. And on the front, we've got a guy called Bobby Latheran, who's a guy from Middlesbrough, who writes songs and has written an autobiography and all the rest of it. And we've got a big interview feature with him in it. But, you know, in the same issue, we've also got a story about a father who was determined that his son wouldn't be looked after by social services, and so he spent his whole life sort of building a life for his son, which didn't involve social workers or nurses or anything like that. We've got an article about why the mental health of people with learning disabilities often isn't noticed or addressed, and that comes back to what I was saying earlier about how sometimes if you're seen as having a learning disability, that's it. You know, people don't think any wider. So some doctors don't really realise that people with learning disabilities can have mental health problems. So we cover articles like that in the magazine.
In terms of the bad language, can I just add that you know when you said the name imbecile, I'm sure I've heard that word used in sort of general terms before, but I know it's not. I do know that it's not a very nice word to use.
You're absolutely right, and it is used a lot, and it's used as an insult, and you quite often hear it in politics and things like that. You know, when people are on two different sides in a political argument, and one will call the other an imbecile. So, first of all, it's a bad thing just because they're insulting them. But what bothers me about it is this is language that's been used to describe, you know, an imbecile in the past was somebody that we'd describe as having mild or moderate learning disabilities today. And it's become an insult, like it's the worst thing that you could be. And I just hate it when I hear words like that being used in people's everyday conversation. I don't think they even understand. Do you know what I mean? When they're using it, it's just the word they've learned, and they don't know what the history of it is or anything. But you hear it a lot. You're absolutely right to have noticed that. Yeah.
I just want to add, I don't know why I'm smiling, because I always wonder where the idea actually came from.
I know. Well, sometimes all you can do is smile, but you know, it's a very sad thing, and that is where it came from. It was a word that was used to describe a certain type of person with a learning disability. But the thing is, that's not what it is anymore. Do you know what I mean? It's become a completely different word, but it's got that history behind it. Yeah.
So, yeah, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, and thank you for those questions. They've just been absolutely brilliant, and a couple of them I thought, oh, how am I going to answer that? So I hope it went okay. Really interesting to talk to you both.
Not a problem.
Thank you all. Great to meet you all, and hopefully that won't be the only time. So I'll see you again soon.
Many thanks to Simon for talking to us today. If you would and like to subscribe to Community Living magazine. Then visit www.clinitiatives.co.uk. Here's a good interview with the MP, Robbie Moore.
People First Keighley and Craven recently held their annual Learning Holiday Conference, where we celebrate all the great work everyone does on the holidays. Our local Member of Parliament, Robbie Moore, dropped by to visit us, and we took the opportunity to ask him a few questions that our members had prepared for him. Hello, Robbie. Thanks for joining us today.
I'm really pleased to be here. So the last time I came to this conference was 2 years ago, just before the pandemic, and it was the last public event that I actually came to. It was this conference that was held 2 years ago, so it's really good to pop in again and say hello to everyone.
As we at our annual Learning Holiday Conference, where we teach people how to live healthy lifestyle, our first question ought to be, what is your favourite healthy meal?
My favourite healthy meal? I would say I do like a good chicken Caesar salad, although probably the most unhealthy part of that is the Caesar dressing. But actually, as a combination, it's probably one of my favourites.
What is your favourite way to exercise?
Cycling. Definitely cycling, really enjoy cycling, because you cover a lot of ground, but also your mind is completely taken off everything and you're completely focused on doing that piece of exercise. So I really enjoy cycling. Second would be getting out with a pair of trainers on and doing a bit of running.
Do you think the government should do more to help people while the cost of living goes up so quickly?
Yeah, I do feel that the government have taken some big steps in the last few weeks. So we've announced a package of £9 billion that is going to go in supporting those that pay council tax, that are band A to D, which should cover around 80% of UK households. That's where they'll get a rebate of £150 on their council tax. And they'll also have a rebate on energy bills of £200. And we've also put in a package of £144 million to local authorities to be able to distribute that money as they see fit to households that might not be benefiting from the other rebates. Energy bills are definitely going to increase. We are going to see those increasing in April, and no doubt will increase towards the end of the year. And we've got the Chancellor's budget on the 23rd of March this year, and I suspect there will be some more measures that are announced in there, because it is a big concern actually, and as an MP I'm getting a lot of correspondence on it now, and I suspect I will be going much more correspondence going forward. So I definitely want to see the government work out how we can get that much more of a targeted support package, which has been announced by the Chancellor already, but make sure that we get that targeted support packages going out to those that absolutely need it as quickly as possible. And that the situation is constantly monitored, so we don't end up in this situation where there's just an announcement now at the beginning of the year and it's not reviewed as the year goes through, as energy prices, utility bills increase.
Would nationalising energy companies help to keep people's bills down?
My view is no, I don't think it would, because if we, as a government, took back the running of all of those utility companies, it would be the taxpayer that would be running them effectively as the government, and it would remove any competition that is associated. And I think one mechanism of keeping bills low is by having competition built into that system, because that drives efficiency within those companies. And it also enables private funds to be utilised for a lot of things to do with research and development, with new technologies that need to be explored to meet the government's green agenda that's been set. Whereas if it was all brought in-house and the government were running that, it removes, in my view, the ability for driving down prices from a competition point of view and an efficiency point of view. And we shouldn't underestimate the power that can have in trying to keep energy prices as low as they can be for the consumer.
Is the government going far enough with its actions against Russia?
I think that there's much more that can be done, absolutely. The situation in Ukraine is changing constantly. I get a briefing, as all MPs do, very early on a morning, every day at the moment, and the situation is not good. We should not underestimate the seriousness of the situation, and we can see that absolutely with the number of refugees that is increasing on a daily basis. But also, let's be frank here, we are dealing with an international tyrant in Putin who has completely lost his mind, in my view. He is a war criminal as far as I'm concerned. Are we doing enough with economic sanctions? The measures that we've put in place are huge at the moment. I think there's more that we can do. And the reason we're doing that is because we need to make sure that the Russian economy becomes completely dysfunctional, so that, that there is pressure almost put internally by Russian people on Putin and the regime that he is running, so that the Russian people can almost make it absolutely clear to their leader that the position that Russia is now taking on the global stage is completely untenable. Of course, much more that can be done, but I do think that the government have reacted in a fairly short space of time. You know, we're nearly into 3 weeks since the invasion first happened, and the amount of economic sanctions that have been put in so far have been hard-hitting. And tomorrow, actually, in Westminster, we're voting on the economic crime bill, which will further enhance some of those sanctions that have been put in place.
Can you do anything to improve mental health crisis services in our area?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I mean, mental health, mental well-being, and has absolutely, and all the issues and offside issues associated with that have dramatically increased as being an issue over the course of the last 24 months over the pandemic. It was a big issue before, but the pandemic has definitely exacerbated that. At a national level, the government have ring-fenced 2.3 billion in the NHS long-term plan, which is ring-fenced for improving mental health services. What I want to see is make sure that, you know, it's fine having these headline announcements of funds, but it's got to reach the people that need it as quickly as possible. And that's where, again, working with education providers, primary and secondary, what I want to see is, and this is working with government as well, is specifically trained counsellors going into those education environments at a very early age as well, so that we can provide that support through those settings, so we're not relying on teaching staff to be doing that, so that the teachers can concentrate on providing education. And in the last month there was a package, I think 79 million, that was announced that's specifically to go for that counselling services to be installed in primaries and secondaries. And locally, I think there's a lot more work to be done in terms of bringing those organisations, charitable sector, as well as the education sector, together actually more through a targeted approach, and actually how we can utilise public funds, government funds, better to make sure that those that need it are absolutely getting it. I mean, the main concerns that I'm hearing at the moment, and it's been going on for a long time, is issues around diagnosis, issues around waiting times, and then making sure that support is then provided throughout an individual's journey to get better, get to a state of having better mental well-being. And it's an issue. I mean, I'm not going to shy away from it. It is a big issue, and I don't think we have seen it at its worst yet, because people have still got huge anxieties as a result of the pandemic, and that it's undoubtedly created a lot of pressure.
What is the Keighley Town's fund money going to be spent on?
Well, I think that so it's going on some good projects. I mean, all the projects have been generally allocated now. So we've managed to secure £33.6 million from the government that's ring-fenced to spend in Keighley. Of that, there's just over 14 million that's going on a development investment fund. The great thing about that is it's focusing on the brownfield sites, because we've got a lot of them, and some key brownfield sites. And the idea with that is to try and make those brownfield sites into a state that they're investable for a private sector organisation to come in and invest their private money into these sites so we can try and get some job creation out of these sites. So that money's been used on, addressing highways issues, contamination issues, but getting them to a state that site becomes investable. But actually some of the more other exciting projects we've got a skills hub that's getting built, a manufacturing, engineering and future tech hub, and that's been done in conjunction with Keighley College and other businesses. And the general theme of that is about increasing the skill set and the skills offering that we've got through adults wanting to reskill or upskill, or those that are coming out of school and working with Keighley College, getting more involved in the manufacturing, engineering, and tech side. And we've got some money going in. We've got some money going in to build a new health and wellbeing hub as well, which is much needed. If you look at Holycroft, that's not in a great state of repair at all, so I'm pleased that we've secured a chunk of funds for that. Some money going into Keighley Creative and the Keighley Arts and Films Festival. And there is also a general pot of funds which is called the Community Grant Fund, which is then getting allocated to smaller projects, much smaller projects, but equally just as important, right across Keighley. So lots of good things that are coming on the back of it, really.
Do you think it's a good idea or a bad idea? In Leeds Bowwood Airport is not being expanded.
Leeds Bradford, as the airport itself, have decided that they're now not going to press ahead at this moment in time with the expansion and building their new terminal. I am very supportive of anything which drives economic growth for the area. I think we live in an area that absolutely needs as much support from an infrastructure perspective as we can to make sure that we're really concentrating on economic growth. The airport, as a commercial business in themselves, will have to make that decision as to actually, given the state of play, having had 22 months of complete disrupted travel as a result of the pandemic, as to whether or not actually that project is feasible enough for them to take forward. And that, that's a decision for them to make. But yes, I do think that if there is an economic case for driving forward projects, infrastructure projects like that are having a knock-on impact that is going to drive money coming into our area, job creation, economic growth, alongside making sure all the mitigating factors are put in place to do with the environment, etc., I am generally supportive of those types of schemes.
That's all the questions we have for you now. Many thanks for speaking to us today.
And thanks for having me.
Many thanks to both forecasts. Thanks for listening to this episode of a podcast. If you enjoyed it, please like, share, and leave us with you. It really does help us to reach the listeners. Thank you.